Hi there, Year 10s. Welcome to Mr. Wilson TV. This is our first lesson together with our new remote learning situation. So I hope you're all doing well and all staying healthy. We're going to focus today on a poem called Poppies. Now, Poppies is one of the 15 poems from our Power and Conflict anthology, so you'll be expected to know it inside and out. To start with, your starter today is you have 5 minutes to write as much as you can in answer to the following question. What is the significance of the poppy, and what else could have been chosen to honour the sacrifice of those who died in conflict? I'm going to pause these videos once we've told you what you're going to do. You're going to run your own timer, so give yourself 5 minutes. Once you have finished, you can unpause the video and either see how well you did or move on to the next task. So at this stage, get your book out, answer this question and time yourself for 5 minutes. Once you've done that, restart the video. Okay, so you might have come up with a variety of different things, but hopefully you will have had something interesting. So perhaps it might have been something to do with the cross, like many war graves were crosses, although that does exclude most of the soldiers who were non-Christian. You could have had perhaps a colour, so khaki would have been related to the First World War, but it used to be, for the British Army uniform, used to be bright red. So something that perhaps is more inclusive. Might just be simply a flag. So a variety of different things you could have come up with. Whichever you have, I'm sure that's fine. We now need to actually read the poem. So in the lesson attachment, in Google Classroom, you'll find a copy of the full poem. If you are struggling with understanding it, because there are some tricky phrases, I'm always going to recommend you go to some of the other sites that I've included in our lessons before to go and get a better understanding. However, in this case, I don't want you to do that yet. I want you to try and answer these questions first before you go on to try and find something to help you understand the poem better. For me, the best way you're going to have an understanding of this poem is actually by trying to solve the problems it presents yourselves. So there are 6 questions. The first, very simply, is what's happening in the poem. The second, who is speaking in the poem. You need to identify the speaker's different emotions through the poem, so look at each different stanza and how they might change. Is there anything in this poem that suggests the idea of a journey? And what examples of sensory language are there? And what different phrases suggest these keywords? So you're looking for any phrases or words that link to those keywords. So pause the video once you're ready to start, answer these questions, and then when you come back, I'll give you some answers. Don't cheat. You done? Okay, we're going to move on then. So, some of the answers for you. So the poem is about a mother remembering the last time she saw her son when he left to join the army or want some kind of military service and go off to war, we assume. And we assume that because of the way she describes the memories of him as though he's now no longer around. There's a particular date, Armistice Sunday at the beginning, and leading through to the War Memorial, so that kind of journey that tells us perhaps she is either lost without him or is seeking some kind of way of remembering him and maintaining his memory. So question number two, the answer is an unnamed military mother. Don't be confused between the narrator and the poet. So Jane Weir, whilst she has a mother, she doesn't have sons who were killed in warfare, fortunately for her. The other reason it's important there's an unnamed mother is because this poem is intended to be applicable to all mothers who've seen their sons or daughters go off to war. Question 3, there are various emotions as you go through. I've picked on kind of 4.5. In the beginning, it's very matter of fact. It just tells you when and where, what's going on. It doesn't really tell you anybody's died, doesn't tell you anything about anything in terms of narrative anyway. So initially, it's just establishing when and where this is taking place. Stanza 2 is far more caring. You look at how the mother begins to establish physical contact with her son and starts to demonstrate a sense of protection about him. Number 3 is, I guess, a microcosm of the poem as a whole, where it's it's more lurching and confused and emotional, and without a kind of structure, recognizable structure anyway, that makes you feel and perhaps empathize with the emotions that the mother is feeling. So there's certainly a sense of confusion and uncertainty. In that fourth stanza, where the kind of narrative journey of the mother has ended up in the graveyard, it's definitely more entirely about grief. So this dove that she has followed to the church now leaves, as though its purpose is complete. It has led her to the graveyard, to the war memorial, where she can trace her hands over the names of those soldiers who've died, and the dove's purpose is complete. So that can be interpreted in a number of ways. The idea that the dove as a symbol of peace has provided the mother with peace and closure at the graveyard. You can sort of see how that could be connected. Also, you could interpret it as, well, the dove has left, so that means there is no peace, and therefore war is relentless and never-ending. I think both of those, for example, have merit, as long as you can justify it and explain it well. I think that you can use either of those. So question 4, some of the key words that show, or phrases that show it's a journey. Look at how she uses the pronoun you and how she relates to her son. So before you left, as I walked with you, you were away, after you'd gone, and then on reaching the top of the hill. So you have that, but you could also incorporate the phrases around the date. So the idea that most stories have a specific time in which they're set, and this establishes that as it being Armistice Sunday or Remembrance Sunday, which tells us firstly it has to be after 1918 when that tradition was introduced. And bearing in mind the language is quite modern, we can infer that it's quite a modern poem, perhaps referring to soldiers who died in wars in Afghanistan or Iraq or perhaps the Balkans. So more modern conflict, perhaps since the 80s and 90s and beyond. There is lots and lots of sensory language, tons. So think about the colours, think about the tactile aspect of it. There was, to run her fingers through the black thorns of your hair, gelled black thorns of your hair. Those kind of things, really great to help us understand what the mother is feeling and going through. And that use of sensory language is incredibly important because it helps us get under the skin of the narrator of the poem, and to really understand what their feelings are around death and emotion. So I've picked, what's that, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, 9, isn't it? 9 words that I think we should be really trying to use in any writing to demonstrate our understanding of what the poem contains. There's always lots more in a poem than you probably initially think. So I've picked a couple. So protection, you could have had blockade or bandage, and I've gone with smooth down your shirt's upturned collar. The idea of touching someone's collar and tidying it up is quite a nice sense of protective, motherly behaviour. So loss, her feeling of loss, she is slowly melting, her words are melting. It's almost as if that memory of him is like a snowman and is over time it's disappearing, which is quite a sad thing to realise. Memory, so she has lots of memories, and lots of it. I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial rather than a specific analeptic kind of memory, because it makes me feel like that the memorial is a permanent structure that she can use as a lodestone, a touchstone, let's say, that always will be there and help her with her memories, whereas those other memories, like we said, they're kind of melting, so perhaps they're fading. Childhood, I put play at Eskimo, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little, which is quite cute. Innocence, hoping to hear your playground voice. I've picked them in that way. They could be reversed. There's quite a good crossover between childhood and innocence, as you can imagine. And in this poem, her strongest memories are those of when he wasn't a teenager. He was a child. He was a young child, and the sense that those are the memories she'll never lose. Grief. Whilst the poem as a whole is inevitably going to be about grief and loss, picking one particular quotation to support that idea is sometimes tricky. I quite liked her use of the phrase "my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats," as it makes us feel like that list of things is ongoing, and it's perhaps going on longer than you would imagine. We all, we all have a stomach. We feel those kind of the butterflies in your stomach, or that nervousness, or that sickness in times of difficulty and especially grief. So that's quite nice that it helps us understand the kind of physiological experience. Conflict, I picked a few words that might relate to warfare. It's interesting that it doesn't use, there's no guns, grenades, tanks, batteries. It's quite subtle. So the spasms that she talks about, whilst it's a spasm of red like a poppy, obviously we would imagine that by the title, it could also be the kind of wound of a soldier being shot. So something like that poppy that she's in a sort of ritualistically placing it upon her son could also be a horrible reminder in that memory of when he left her, of what happened to him later on. And that idea of giving your soldier son something that is meant to remind people of dead soldiers and deceased service personnel whilst they're going off to war is quite challenging for that mother. Must be quite difficult to marry the two together, saying, "Oh, good luck, go and be successful and come back soon," with "Don't forget your colleagues died." It's quite difficult. With potential, this is quite interesting. I like the idea of this as it's one of my favourite quotes: "The world overflowing like a treasure chest." It's as if the potential for that son opening that front door, going out on his own, being independent is incredible. It's such a great opportunity for him to take what you like from the world, and the mother has to deal with that being taken away from her. So that's quite a difficult feeling if you realise that person now won't fulfil that potential. And lastly, fabric. So there is an extended metaphor, a semantic field throughout Poppies of fabric. So pinned, crimped, binding, collar, felt, pleats, scarves, gloves, even darts and tucks are all, and there was coat as well. I think there's lots of words that relate back to fabric, as Jane Weir has a real fascination with fabric. She recently, I say recently, but within the last decade, brought out a poetry anthology purely focused on fabric, and her interest in that. So that's quite interesting how that's then presented, and it's also interesting because you're getting this under the poet, not just she likes fabric and therefore let's write about it in a poem, but it's a very tactile poem. It has a lot of touching and feeling, and the idea that something that's in your hands can slip away so easily. So quite a nice choice of semantic field there that gives us as a reader a little bit more depth in that poem. We get to really feel what the narrator is feeling as well. So the last thing we're going to look at is a little bit about context. It's always really important with poetry to bear in mind when it was written, when it was set, who's it appealing to, and just a little bit of an oversight on that at this stage. So this is, as we've mentioned about the language and the types of words that are used, it's probably set in the modern day, but it reaches back, it leans on that tradition of the Poppy Day, Armistice Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, which marked the end of World War I in 1918, and every year on the 1st of November we commemorate the loss of soldiers, naval personnel, airmen, anybody involved in the armed services that have died because of their desire to protect the rest of us. So when it was written, soldiers were dying in the Middle East, and it was a way of trying to understand or help people understand their suffering, and the fact that it's not just the person who dies who suffers, but their family and their friends and the people they know as well. And Poet Laureate Caroline Duffy asked Jane Weir to write this poem, or write a poem that could be incorporated in that anthology that she put together specifically around this time. So around the idea of around the theme rather of loss and militaristic celebration as much as commemoration. So I guess the key thing to remember is always what's happening. It's really important in a poem that we understand that the narrator and the poet are not the same person in most cases, and the what is happening is almost like if I said to you, "Oh, what's happened in Romeo and Juliet?" You'd recount the story to me as far as you know it. And this is the case with this poem. It's really to be really clear how we retell the story, the narrative, that and why it's so important. And the idea in this case of a narrative is one that leads her as a narrator through different stages of grief and different memories, right to the end. That's that idea of her leaning on the war memorial, perhaps for physical as much as moral support. Tells a real deep and personal story, but which can be applied to many mothers all around the world. So, really good poem. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you managed to unpick it a little bit, if you like my little fabric reference there, and learn a little bit more about it so it makes a bit more sense. We're looking out for patterns, of course, in poetry to make sense of it, but also to make it easy for us to analyse the intentions of the poet and the message and the mood that we get from these. So our next lesson will be more about poppies. We're going to try and do, as we have done in school, we're going to do it out of school with 2 lessons on each poem. This essentially is now set up with the reading, a little bit of the context, a few quick questions, and the next lesson is most likely going to be a more extended essay answer to a more challenging question. So I look forward to seeing you then, and hopefully you're enjoying your new experiences at home. Bye for now.